What you're about to hear is a guided summary of one of the most bracing books ever written about why some peoples, nations, and regions prosper while others remain poor. Thomas Sowell, the economist and social theorist who spent his long career at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, set out in Wealth, Poverty, and Politics to do something that sounds simple but is in fact almost revolutionary: to look at the actual causes of economic disparities rather than the moral stories we like to tell about them. First published in 2015 and expanded in 2016, this is a work of enormous range, drawing on geography, history, demography, and culture to ask a question most people assume they already know the answer to. Why are some groups rich and others poor? Sowell's answer is uncomfortable for almost everyone. He dismantles the assumption that economic equality is the natural baseline from which any deviation must be explained by villainy. Instead, he argues that the production of wealth, not its distribution, is what we ought to be studying, and that the factors driving wealth production are wildly unequal across the globe and always have been. This is a summary, told in my own words, of how he builds that case. What follows tracks his argument as it unfolds, from the framing of the problem through the great forces of geography, culture, demography, and politics, to his sobering conclusions. Settle in. This is a book that rewards patience, because Sowell is not interested in slogans. He is interested in evidence, and he has assembled a mountain of it. Issues. Sowell opens by clearing the ground, and the first thing he clears away is a hidden assumption buried in almost every modern discussion of inequality: the idea that equal outcomes would be the normal state of affairs if only no one interfered. He turns that assumption upside down. Across all of human history, on every continent, among every people, vast disparities in wealth and achievement have been the rule, not the exception. The real question is not why inequality exists, but why anyone ever expected equality in the first place. He draws a sharp and clarifying distinction between the production of wealth and its distribution. Most political argument fixates on how the existing pie is sliced, treating wealth as if it simply exists, and the only moral question is who gets what. But wealth has to be produced before it can be distributed, and the capacity to produce it is spread very unevenly across human societies for reasons that have nothing to do with anyone being cheated. To talk about distribution while ignoring production, Sowell argues, is to misunderstand the entire problem. He also takes aim at the loaded language that saturates these debates, words like gap and distribution that quietly imply someone did the distributing, that resources were handed out and the handing out was unfair. Real economies don't work that way. Incomes are earned in millions of separate transactions, not parceled out by some central authority. The takeaway here is quiet but firm. When we let emotionally charged vocabulary do our thinking for us, we end up explaining the world with grievances instead of facts. Sowell wants us to start with reality as it actually is, radically unequal, and not because of conspiracy. Geographic factors. From here, Sowell turns to the most physical and least controversial of the forces shaping prosperity: geography, and he shows that geography is far more than mountains and rivers on a map. It is a vast, silent determinant of which peoples came into contact with the wider world's knowledge and which were left isolated. Consider waterways. Navigable rivers and accessible harbors have, throughout history, been highways of commerce and ideas. Societies built along them traded, borrowed, and learned from a much larger pool of human achievement, while societies cut off by waterfalls, rapids, or harborless coasts developed in isolation. Sowell notes that sub-Saharan Africa, for all its size, has a coastline with remarkably few natural harbors and rivers that plunge over escarpments before reaching the sea. Geography that throttled contact with the outside world for millennia. Western Europe, by contrast, has an enormously long and indented coastline relative to its area, riddled with harbors and navigable rivers. Then there are mountains, which isolate the people who live in them. Mountain communities the world over, in the Appalachians, the Scottish Highlands, the Rif of Morocco, tend to share a striking set of traits: cultural conservatism, poverty, and distance from the currents of progress flowing through the lowlands and ports. Climate, animals, and diseases compound all this. The great domesticable animals and the crops suited to temperate zones were not distributed equally across the Earth, and tropical diseases sapped the productivity of entire regions. None of this is anyone's fault. It is simply the unequal hand that geography dealt. What emerges from this section is a profound humbling of the modern conceit that human beings start as blank equals upon whom only society writes. The physical world itself, long before any politics, set peoples on radically different paths of exposure to the accumulated knowledge of mankind. Geography does not determine destiny in some iron way, but it stacks the deck, and pretending otherwise is to begin every analysis with a falsehood. Cultural factors. Sowell then moves from the land to something carried inside people, culture. If geography determines what knowledge a people could access, culture determines what they do with it, whether they are open to learning from others or closed, whether their habits and attitudes build wealth or dissipate it. He develops the powerful idea of cultural diffusion, the borrowing of skills, technologies, and ways of doing things from other peoples. No society advances on its own inventions alone. Every prosperous civilization stands on a vast inheritance borrowed from others. The cultures that flourished were typically those willing to absorb whatever worked from wherever it came, swallowing their pride to learn from strangers. Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, is his great example, a nation that deliberately sent its people abroad to learn and transformed itself within a few generations. Cultures that turned inward, that treated their own ways as complete and foreign ways as contemptible, paid a heavy price in stagnation. Culture, in Sowell's telling, is not a matter of pride or identity to be celebrated for its own sake. It is a toolkit for living, and some toolkits work better than others for producing prosperity. Attitudes toward work, toward education, toward saving, toward honesty in commerce, toward time itself. These vary enormously across groups, and they have enormous economic consequences. He insists, with characteristic bluntness, that not all cultural patterns are equally productive, and that the polite refusal to say so does no favors to the people trapped in patterns that hold them back. The takeaway he leaves is one that cuts against a great deal of contemporary sentiment. To say that cultures differ in their economic results is not bigotry, it is observation. And the good news buried in it is that culture can change. Peoples have transformed their fortunes by changing their habits and opening themselves to what works. What cannot help anyone is the flattering lie that all ways of living lead equally to flourishing. Social factors. The argument deepens as Sowell takes up social factors, and here he treats two subjects most writers approach with great timidity: population and human mental capabilities. He approaches both with the same insistence on data over comfort. On population, he examines how the size, age structure, and movement of peoples shape economic outcomes. The geographic distribution of populations, patterns of migration, and the way different groups cluster in different occupations all bear on prosperity in ways that have nothing to do with discrimination. He looks closely at how immigrant groups have carried particular skills across the world, and how the same group can thrive in one country and struggle in another, depending on the surrounding conditions. On mental capabilities, Sowell wades into the fraught territory of intelligence testing and group differences, and he does so to make a careful point rather than an inflammatory one. He notes that measured intellectual performance is not fixed across time, that the IQ scores of entire nations and groups have risen substantially over generations. The phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, which alone should demolish any notion that test results capture some permanent racial essence. The very groups once written off as innately inferior on such tests later rose to and past the old norms as their circumstances changed. The lesson Sowell draws is a defense of human potential against fatalism of every kind. Both the old fatalism that declared certain peoples permanently incapable and the newer fatalism that explains every disparity as the residue of oppression. Human capabilities are real, they are developed rather than merely inherited, and they respond to the whole environment of geography and culture that came before. The takeaway is a kind of sober hope. Nothing in the data condemns any people to permanent poverty, but neither will wishing away real differences in developed skills make anyone prosperous. Political factors. Only now, after geography, culture, and society, does Sowell turn to politics. And the placement is itself an argument. Politics is not the foundation of prosperity. It enters late, and it more often destroys wealth than creates it. He examines political institutions, the politics of diversity, and the welfare state, and his verdict on each is skeptical. Political institutions matter, he grants, but mostly by getting out of the way. The rule of law, secure property rights, and reliable enforcement of contracts create the conditions in which people can produce and trade. Where these are absent, where the state is predatory, corrupt, or arbitrary, wealth cannot accumulate no matter how favorable the geography. But the modern temptation is to believe that political action can manufacture prosperity directly, and this Sowell regards as a dangerous illusion. Politicians respond to incentives that have little to do with long-term economic health and everything to do with the next election. His treatment of the politics of diversity is especially pointed. He argues that intellectuals and political entrepreneurs have strong incentives to frame every group disparity as the product of injustice, because grievance is politically useful and emotionally satisfying, even when the actual causes lie in geography or culture or history. This framing, he contends, often harms the very groups it claims to help. By directing their energy toward resentment and political mobilization, rather than toward acquiring the skills and habits that actually produce advancement. And then the welfare state, which he treats as a cautionary tale rather than a solution. Sowell argues that well-intentioned programs frequently produce perverse incentives, rewarding the very behaviors that perpetuate poverty and weakening the family and community structures that historically lifted poor people upward. The dependency such programs foster can prove more durable and more damaging than the material poverty they were meant to cure. The quiet takeaway running through all of this is that the market's coordination of millions of individual decisions, for all its imperfections, allocates resources and rewards productive effort in ways no central authority can match, and that political attempts to override it, however noble in intention, tend to leave the poor worse off than before. Conclusions. Sowell draws his threads together with a refusal to offer the tidy solutions his readers might crave. The disparities he has traced through geography, culture, society, and politics are real, deep, and rooted in causes that stretch back across centuries and continents. They were not created by the people alive today, and they cannot be wished away by redistributing income or by passing laws that command equality into being. He insists on a crucial distinction between economic differences that reflect genuine differences in productivity and those that might reflect injustice. And he argues that honest analysis must do the hard work of telling them apart, rather than assuming every gap is a grievance. The prospects he sketches are neither utopian nor despairing. Peoples have risen from poverty before, often dramatically, by acquiring the skills, habits, and knowledge that produce wealth, frequently by borrowing them from others. The path upward is real, but it runs through the patient development of human capital, not through the politics of resentment. His final reflection turns to goals, and here he asks what we are actually trying to achieve. If the goal is to lift people out of poverty, then we should study what has actually lifted people out of poverty and do more of it. If the goal is instead to express moral indignation, to score political points, or to feel righteous about inequality, then we will keep doing the things that feel good and fail. Sowell's closing posture is that of a man who has looked at the evidence without flinching and refuses to comfort us with illusions. Because illusions are precisely what keep the poor poor. Taken as a whole, wealth, poverty, and politics is a sustained act of intellectual honesty about a subject drowning in sentiment. What you carry forward from it is a permanent suspicion of any explanation of poverty that begins and ends with blame, and a corresponding respect for the slow, real forces, physical, cultural, inherited, that actually shape the fortunes of nations and peoples. Sowell teaches you to ask of any claim about inequality, where does wealth actually come from, and does this explanation account for how it is produced, or only for how it is resented? That single discipline of mind will change how you read the news for the rest of your life. There is something deeply humane beneath Sowell's unsentimental surface. He takes the poor seriously enough to tell them the truth, and he honors human potential by insisting that circumstances, not some fixed essence, set peoples on their paths, and that circumstances can change. This is a far more hopeful book than its reputation suggests, but its hope is the durable kind, built on reality rather than wishes. I can only give you the shape of the argument here. The full force of it lives in the hundreds of pages of evidence Sowell marshals, the cases and comparisons and histories he lays side by side until the pattern becomes undeniable. Read the whole book. It is long, it is rigorous, and it will repay every hour you give it.